Status quo bias refers to the emotional inclination people have towards preserving their existing or past circumstances, or the hesitation to initiate changes. This bias is often rooted in perceiving the current baseline status quo as a benchmark where deviations are seen as either gains or losses. While the status quo bias is psychologically driven, it is distinct from the rational choice of maintaining the status quo, when it is objectively superior to proposed alternatives. Additionally, the bias differs from psychological inertia, or the inaction in current circumstances. Beyond everyday decision-making, the status quo bias significantly impacts decisions related to economics, retirement plans, health, and ethics. It aligns with other subconscious cognitive processes such as loss, aversion, existence bias, endowment effect, and regret avoidance. Status quo bias can be observed experimentally through the reversal test and has been studied extensively by many researchers, with notable contributions by Kaufman, Thaler, and Nietzsche, who conducted experiments on its correlation with the endowment effect and loss aversion. Furthermore, a status quo bias experiment was demonstrated by Samuelson and Zeckhauser in a hypothetical financial investment scenario. The results highlighted how the alternative that was presented as the status quo gained more popularity, indicating the prevalence of the bias. Also, it was found that the presence of a status quo biased the recipients towards it when making decisions, and that this bias increased as the number of choices expanded. However, the discernibility of a strong preference could reduce this bias. In summary, the status quo bias refers to the consistent evidence of an emotional preference for maintaining current circumstances and resisting change. Its impact spans from simple daily decisions to complex choices in finance and health, highlighting the critical need for understanding and addressing its effects. In the context of tort law reform, citizens could opt for either high-priced auto insurance with full rights to sue or less costly insurance with limited legal rights. In New Jersey, the default was cheaper insurance, while Pennsylvania had the expensive option as the default. A survey by Johnson, Hershey, Mazzaros, and Kunruther, 1993, examined whether consumers would stick with their state's default car insurance option. Their findings indicated a strong bias towards the status quo, as only 20 of New Jersey drivers and 25 of Pennsylvania motorists switched from the default. The study underlines the significant financial implications of framing and status quo bias. In the Dutch healthcare system, where general practitioners act as gatekeepers, Boonen, Donkers, and Schutt conducted 2 distinct choice experiments to understand consumer preferences. The researchers aimed to determine the extent of status quo bias in patients' decisions to stay with or leave their current physicians. Despite recognizing no significant benefits of staying with their current provider or noticing quality differences between potential practitioners, 35 of the respondents preferred to stay with their current physician. Even willing to pay a copayment, only 30 of the respondents were willing to switch doctors for a financial benefit. Interestingly, the value consumers placed on remaining with their existing practitioner outstripped other perks offered, such as discounts or quality certification. In situations where the current doctor and a hypothetical one had identical attributes, the current practitioner was chosen 40 more often than if both were hypothetical. This finding reiterates the strong influence of status quo bias in healthcare consumer decisions. Despite positive financial or qualitative incentives, or the introduction of negative financial incentives, consumer hesitation to switch from their current physician remained high. The study concluded that overcoming the status quo bias and encouraging patients to switch to a different practitioner was a formidable challenge. The story explores the concept of the status quo bias, which describes a preference for the current state of affairs due to cognitive or informational limitations. The narrative hinges on the perceived safety and continuity and the possible risks associated with change. Evaluating decisions is often filled with uncertainties, so sticking to known paths can be seen as the safer, somewhat satisfactory solution. The cognitive expenses that come with deciding, such as selecting between multiple options, further reinforce the status quo bias, as maintaining the current situation often needs less intellectual exertion. Hence, the benefits of a transformative choice may be overshadowed by the mental challenges it presents, leading to the preservation of the existing situation. This reasoning pushes the narrative into a discussion of various cognitive biases that are connected and obscured by the resistance to break the status quo. The discourse revolves around ideas like existence bias and longevity, where the presence of something in our lives is often equated to its goodness. These viewpoints perpetuate the allure of the status quo, encouraging a predilection for the known and familiar. This extends to the aversion to risk and action. Just as existence is seen to be good, its length and continuity are deemed to be better. Given this mindset, elements that have survived are thought to be more suitable than the unfamiliar or potential options. The narrative also introduces concepts such as the fear of regret, psychological inertia, and the mere exposure effect to explain the inclination towards the status quo. These factors, along with loss aversion, further support the decision to stick to the known path. They enhance an ingrained avoidance towards taking risks, prompting a preference for inaction over action. However, this perspective is challenged towards the end of the discourse. Focusing on loss aversion, the notion that the potential losses from changing the status quo outweigh potential gains is explored with a counter-argument. It suggests that perhaps the bias towards the status quo may not be totally due to fear of losses, but rather a general tendency towards inertia or resistance to intervene in life's course. This sets the stage for a shift in the narrative, indicating potential turning points in future plot developments. The study primarily seeks to explore the concept of omission bias, often mistaken for status quo bias in decision-making. Essentially, omission bias is evidenced when the decision-maker opts for a more harmful outcome resulting from non-action rather than a less damaging action-oriented result. Researchers Ilana Ratov and Jonathan Barron have conducted a study highlighting this bias. Their findings suggest it may appear when a decision-maker chooses not to select from the presented options, reducing instances where contrasting benefits and consequential weight of decisions are necessary. The study also introduces the reversal test concept. It challenges the decision-maker to consider alternate scenarios and question the parameters that lead to unfavorable outcomes. Essentially, if any changes in parameters lead to bad outcomes, then those involved must elucidate why these parameters can't be tweaked for improvement, potentially revealing a status quo bias. Furthermore, the study elaborates on the cognitive impact of status quo decisions, with evidence showing that faulty status quo rejections have a more profound neurological impact than wrongful acceptances. This imbalance could propel future decisions toward status quo bias. This was tested through a visual task, where subjects exhibit a preference for the default in challenging decisions, generating more errors. The role of the subthalamic nucleus in decision-making was explored, shedding light on its increased activity when moving away from the status quo during high-stakes decisions. Furthermore, the influence of the inferior frontal cortex, particularly active during difficult decisions on the STAN, was also examined. Researchers from University College London further expanded the discourse, probing into the neural pathways contributing to status quo biases. They discovered a correlation between the difficulty of the decision and a tendency towards non-action. The brain scanning of participants playing a tennis line judgments game using functional MRI, fMRI, formed the crux of this study, initially published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, PNAS. Set against the backdrop of behavioral economics, a pair of scholars devised an automatic enrollment scheme designed to boost the retirement savings of a certain company's workforce. This scheme still allowed employees to opt out if they wished, but required them to take an active stance. To do so, their findings spotlighted the phenomenon of status quo bias, alongside related effects. They found that default decisions not only stemmed from subconscious bias, but remained unaffected even when the inherent intent of the default was disclosed to the consumers. In one case study, carried out by Singh Gang, it was unveiled that people tend to allocate more thought to default options compared to their alternatives due to their risk, averse nature, and the desire for greater expected utility with less subjective uncertainty. As a result, these individuals' understanding of the default's value tends to be more exact than those of the alternatives. The behavior demonstrates the concept of asymmetric choice error, a telltale sign of status quo bias. It is worth remembering that status quo bias in education can simultaneously present both a hurdle to political advancements and a menace to the state's credibility. It is rooted in the virtues of stability, obedience, and patriotism, which appeals not necessarily due to the intrinsic merits of existing institutions, but rather because they're already in place. Status quo bias has been manifesting notably in critical real-life decisions, including healthcare plan selections and retirement programs. There's a school of thought suggesting that an inclination toward the status quo is integral to conservative ideologies in societies where governmental control is limited and individual actions are regulated. On the flip side, in societies with liberal leanings, any move to impose restrictions on individuals or governments are met with considerable resistance from status quo proponents. Regardless of societal norms, this bias generally acts as a roadblock to progressive initiatives unless provoked into action, erupting into a backlash against the existing authorities. Status quo bias could be seen as the primary culprit behind the widespread opposition to overall human enhancement and, more specifically, genetic cognitive enhancement. Even so, some morale philosophers argue that the bias may not necessarily be irrational in such scenarios. The rationality of status quo bias also comes to the forefront when examining the morale implications surrounding disability. The story primarily delves into the pervasive presence of status quo bias, the tendency to maintain existing behaviors, beliefs, or decisions, even when better alternatives arise. This pervasive issue was examined across multiple studies, exposing its influence in many fields such as medicine, retirement planning, negotiation, and price management. One such study focused on asthma patients, assessing their preference for continuing with existing medication in spite of being offered superior alternative. This investigation concluded that status quo bias was indeed prevalent in these scenarios. Particularly regarding medicines taken on a daily basis, the study strongly suggests the need to account for this bias by including the option of current medication in choice surveys. Status quo bias was again revealed in a 1986 experiment related to retirement savings, where participants showed reluctance to switch between two investment funds over time, regardless of the differing returns. This bias was particularly evident in older participants, who were more inclined to stick with their initial choices, in spite of new information. There were additional studies that sought to reveal the association of status quo bias in various areas. Korobkin identified its influence in contract negotiations, indicating a bias favoring inaction under certain circumstances, whereas Heifetz and Segev revealed a similar trend called donus biases, which influences sellers' behavior, akin to the well-known endowment effect. Furthermore, status quo bias emerged as a significant factor in bridging the theory-practice gap in price management studies. Berger's research recognized the bias as a potential influencer of numerous identified rationality deficits, as per Rolcotter's 2009 study, and highlighted its role in multiple phases of the price management process as described by Simon and Fastnack in 2016. Berger's further revealed that status quo bias could lead to an over-reliance on traditional external information sources in the analysis phase of price management. Interestingly, in the implementation phase, this bias could even result in the final pricing decision being left to decentralized staff. Influenced by existing profitability within price management practices, this multifaceted analysis offers a comprehensive insight into the prevalence and impact of status quo bias. Status quo bias plays a significant role in shaping economic research and influencing policy decisions. This bias is linked to the anchoring and adjustment theory in economics, which suggests that a person's decision-making is largely anchored on their initial point of reference, typically the status quo for consumers. The default option or the status quo often seems more comprehensible and offers less uncertainty than other alternatives. This perception is particularly true for risk-averse decision-makers who foresee higher expected utility in maintaining the status quo. The effect of the status quo bias is further deepened by the loss aversion theory, where consumers often perceive the potential disadvantages of deviating from the status quo as outweighing any advantages. This is evidenced by an economic approach that portrays a negative and twice as sharp decline in consumer utility function for losses compared to gains. Accordingly, consumers may view a loss as more detrimental, hence opt to adhere to the status quo. However, this tendency to choose the status quo contradicts the concept of rational consumer choice theory, which assumes consumers will aim to maximize their utility. As such, the impact of status quo bias on consumer behavior poses significant implications for understanding and interpreting economic theories.